In the last tutorial, you saw that the drum set of a pop band is normally set dead center in the middle of the stage. However, that doesn't mean that you pan all of the drum tracks to center. Instead, drums are a very unique animal because a drum set is comprised of lots of different instruments, and it's also kind of a large instrument, so if you're standing in front of a drum set, certain instruments of that drum set are going to be heard more in your left ear than in the right ear. And what you want to do is reproduce that stereo environment for the end listener. So when you're panning your drum tracks, you want to keep that in mind. So we have 11 different tracks in our Cubase project, and they consist of 2 different bass drum microphones, 2 different snare drum microphones, 1 hi-hat mic, 1 ride cymbal microphone, 1 microphone each for the 3 different tom-toms, of which there are 1 rack tom and 2 floor toms, and then there's an overhead left microphone and an overhead right microphone. So let's take a look at the drum set that I recorded for this particular project. And this photo isn't the best photo because it was taken at a little bit of an angle, but I'm going to be able to show you the spatial orientation of all of these different instruments of the drum set. Let's start with the bass drum. The bass drum right here is center. So if you were looking at this drum set from an audience perspective, the bass drum would be center, so you'd hear it equally in the left ear and the right ear. In other words, that instrument would be mono. And then the snare drum is also close to center, but it's a little bit off to the right. But a lot of engineers, myself included, usually put the snare drum center as well. Then we have 3 different tom-toms. The first tom-tom is over to the listener's right-hand side, and then the 2 floor toms are placed a little bit further to the listener's left ear. So we would want to pan the tom-toms from right to left. And then the cymbals are all going to be picked up by overhead microphones, except for 2 specific cymbals, which are the hi-hat and the ride cymbal. Now, this particular drummer, Tracy Nielsen, good friend of mine, he actually has his ride cymbal on the audience right-hand side of the drum set. And that's because he plays left-handed on a right-handed drum set. So in Tracy's case, I would want to put that ride cymbal over to the audience right-hand side. Whereas normally, most drummers that play right-handed have the ride cymbal over here on the audience left side of the drum set. But in this particular case, both the hi-hat and the ride cymbal are on the audience right-hand side. So now if we look at the drum set as it was mic'd up, we have 2 different microphones on the bass drum, one inside the bass drum or kick drum, and one on the outside. And then the snare drum has a microphone on top and one underneath. And then the tom-toms all have 1 microphone over the drum head. So here's tom 1, tom 2, and tom 3. And then the overhead microphones are way up here at the top. Here's the audience left-hand side microphone and the audience right-hand side microphone. And then the hi-hat and ride cymbals, the specialized cymbals, also have their own microphones on them. So here's one for the hi-hat and here's another one for the ride cymbal. So now it's time to take those tracks in our Cubase project and pan them to reproduce the stereo image of the drum set from an audience perspective. Now before we do that, I am going to open up the control room part of our mix console because it has a mono and stereo button right on it. That way I can quickly audition what it sounds like before and after. And let me quickly show you how to set up a control room so that you can do this. I'm going to go under the Devices menu, and then I'm going to choose the VST Connections, or you can type F4 on your computer keyboard. And then on this furthest tab, I have the Studio, and I have the control room enabled, and I've created 1 stereo monitor system. So this is monitor 1, and I added that by going to Add Channel and choosing Add Monitor. So once you have 1 monitor, then you choose your audio interface and which stereo outputs you're using on that interface to control your monitor speakers. And then you can close that window and come to the window layout button right here, click on that, and choose the control room and meter section. And that's going to add this control room section to the far right-hand side of our mix console. And here's that all-important little stereo to mono button, and I'll show you how to use that in just a moment. But let's get back to panning the tracks. So we mentioned that on a real drum set, from an audience perspective, the bass drum is in the center. So we're going to leave the bass drums in the center. And then the snare drum is also typically panned center, but this time I'm going to make a small adjustment. I'm going to pan those off to the right a little tiny bit. And I'm going to use that trick that I showed you a little bit earlier about holding down the shift key while you make these adjustments so that you can get finer control. You'll notice that if I move that fader a little tiny bit, it moves in almost increments of 4 or 5. So if I wanted to pan that to R10, can't quite get to R10 unless I hold down the shift key and then make the change. Now I can pan right to R10. So I'm going to use that fine adjustment to get zeroed in on exactly where I want these tracks panned to. Now I'm going to go to the snare under and I'm going to pan it to the exact same degree. So it's going to go to right 10. So the hi-hat on a drum set is positioned a little bit further to the right-hand side. So that's where that hi-hat track is going to go. Then the ride cymbal track is even further away. So it's going to go a wider degree over to the right. And then that first tom-tom is going to be a little bit to the right, but then the floor toms are going to be a little bit to the left, with the floor tom, the farthest floor tom or the lowest pitch floor tom, even further to the left than the other tom-toms. Then the overheads, you can actually just pan hard left and hard right as a starting place, and if that gives you too wide of a stereo mix, then you might want to bring them in a little bit closer to center, depending on how wide of an image you want to get on the drums. So now that we have those tracks panned apart, let's listen to the before and the after. Before I do, I'm going to come all the way over to the group channel track, and I'm going to solo the drums. That way now I'm listening to just the drums themselves. So I'm going to use that stereo and mono button to change from a stereo image from an audience perspective to a mono representation, and you're going to hear a huge difference between the two, assuming, of course, that you are listening to your stereo studio monitors set up in your studio right now, or if you aren't, you'll need to be using headphones, not the speakers on your computer, because they won't offer you enough of a stereo image to really hear what's going on here. So make sure that you're sitting in front of your studio monitors in stereo, or you're wearing headphones to be listening to the before and after results. So let's listen to the drums in stereo right now. Now you're going to need to watch this little stereo and mono button, because now I'm going to bounce back and forth between mono and stereo, and it'll say mono or stereo right here. So we're still listening in stereo, but watch this little button and listen closely. See how big of a difference that makes? Now I'm going to fast forward to a little bit later point in the song where he's doing a lot of tom-tom fills and a lot of cymbal work so that you can really hear those tom-tom and overhead microphone pannings in mono and in stereo. Let's listen to it in stereo first. Now I'm going to play the same section, but play it in mono. Now let me quickly go back to stereo. See, now it's starting to really open up and you get a much wider stereo field, and the listener is going to be able to see with their ears where each of those instruments on the drum set is placed. Even if the listener doesn't really understand that that's happening in their mix, you, the engineer, are taking advantage of your experience and your knowledge and placing them in the stereo field so that your end listener gets a much richer listening experience. And bear in mind that if you're working with a left-handed drummer with a left-handed orientation on the drum set, you're going to want to do the exact opposite panning that I showed you here, with the exception of the overhead microphones. They'll still be left and right, but the tom-toms will be reversed, the hi-hat and ride cymbal will be reversed, and so forth, because you're always trying to reproduce what the listener is going to be hearing if they were in the same room and looking directly at the drum set. And some drummers will actually ask for a drummer's perspective, so an exact opposite of the mix. And if they're paying the bill, you'll need to do what they say, but you're typically going to be using audience perspective as the basis for where you pan individual instruments from left to right. And on a drum set, you need to do that on a track-by-track basis. So now that we've talked about panning drums, let's talk about panning the bass guitar tracks.